Here we are at North House Folk School. Beautiful day. We've been out this week working on baskets. Today we're gonna go through a bunch of different stuff. We're gonna talk about willow baskets. We're gonna talk about birch bark baskets. Many kinds of birch bark baskets. Here's a basket, cedar bark and basswood bark. What other materials? We've got spruce root, we've got basswood bark. Anything else? Maybe that's it. Well, so what I thought we would do is just kind of run down a bunch of different styles of basketry, a bunch of different materials, and talk about the processing and preparation, and also do a little bit of weaving. So let's start with birch bark. This is something we commonly see around North House. Woven, diagonally plated birch bark is what we call this. But how does it get to be like this? No, let's back up. Let's talk about baskets actually first. So what are baskets? They're containers. Think about all the bags, boxes, containers, trays, trivets, more bags, all these things that we use. And where do those things come from? There's vessels, like what do we, and a lot of times people don't know that they need baskets because they're not in their lives until they start using them. Very different than like a soft bag or container. Once you start carrying a basket, everything changes. When you go from having like a hard container that you carry around, it wears very differently. Black ash, another material. So let's start with birch bark. Birch bark is really, here's something that a lot of us recognize. The birch bark. So where does this come from? You can peel birch bark from living trees. That's how you get the best bark. Can you work with bark from dead trees and stuff that you find in the woods? Absolutely. What's it gonna be like? I don't know. I'm gonna try it. Pick it up, bend it, see if it bends. But same thing with bark on living trees. It can be really, really different. So every tree is different. Soil makes trees different qualities in the bark. I harvest a lot in areas that we have permits for areas that are going to be logged. So that's a really great way for somebody who is needing a lot of bark. When people just want a little bit of bark and want to try it, I always say find somebody who's done it and see if you can go with them. Find someone with private land who's maybe cutting stuff for firewood. The big question is always, does it kill the tree? The answer is no. Does it hurt the tree? Kinda. I mean, you're removing a huge part of the tree and it has to heal and recover. So when you're harvesting from trees that are intended to live, the tree needs to be healthy. It needs to be able to, you don't take too much bark, leave too big of a scar. This is really unique. It's just the outer bark. The inner bark stays on the tree. Because this is the part that we use, and this is the layer that's closest to the wood. It's really smooth. It's the strongest part of the bark. What's that? Maybe some kind of insect damage? Anybody know? Fun to speculate. So what do we use birch bark for? We can use it to make woven containers. We can use it to make containers that are folded and stitched, depending on the bark. We look at a lot of qualities in the bark. If we're making stuff that is going to be folded and stitched woven like this, I like to know, is the bark going to split into layers? And if we're going to make something that's going to be folded like this, we want to know, is it pliable? Does it bend? And that has nothing to do with me or how I'm treating the bark, except for in terms of like long-term storage, but just what are the qualities of this bark and what is it suitable for using? What is it suitable for making? Every bark has different qualities. So let's talk about the woven bark. The first thing that we do to prepare it is thin it out a little bit. And that white outer layer, it's really nice. People love it, and it's not very strong. That often goes into our barn pile because it just doesn't. Yeah, I mean, you can see it. It's quite thin. The strongest part of the bark is right in there. So this stuff we can clean up a little bit. This is a really cool tool. It's not exactly necessary. There's a lot of ways to cut bark into strips using a straight edge and a knife. That's actually the main way. Other than this, this is a leather strap cutter. There's a lot of different tools that people have found that work well for this, but I've seen people use a pasta cutter for narrower strips, which is kind of neat. Now we've got our bark strips. Depending on what you're making, the next thing you would do is then thin this out a little bit more. Sometimes you can get 2 or 3 or 4 weavers out of one just by splitting it. Splitting is something that's really important in basketry in almost all materials. It doesn't just happen. Sometimes with the birch bark, you know, it's like a stack of papers and they will pull apart really easily. But you still have to kind of, you know, so there. Yeah, so I ended a little early this time, so it's not such a dramatic change.
All right, we got a decent amount of folks back. Thank you for rejoining us.
Technical difficulties may be resolved. We're not sure. Or I'm not sure if it was technical difficulties. Anyways, we were talking about birch bark, which is a really exciting thing to talk about. But like, let's look at these a little bit closer. There's a lot going on. We have birch bark. How about this rim? Black ash stitched with spruce root. And look, a tiny little basswood bark cord in there too. So, it's good to have a lot of materials on hand. I want to talk about spruce root. So, there's a lot of people like the term evergreen, referring to a large group of trees, but specifically the spruce tree. Here's a spruce bough. See how there's needles all around it, and they're also quite sharp, which you can't feel, but you can just believe me. There's other trees that have really soft needles. And then there's the spruce bark is a really good way to tell what a tree is by looking at the bark, which I don't have a sample of. But spruce root is just a really common stitching all over the world, wherever there's spruce trees anyways. Any conifer root can work is what I hear, but spruce root is the most common. Maybe it's stronger. I've never done tests to see what's the best. But I dug some spruce root this morning. I went to an area where it's spruce plantation, so spruce trees growing in nice tidy little rows and nothing else growing in between. So that's a really great way to dig spruce.
To everyone watching, we have had some technical difficulties, but we think they're permanently solved now. Thank you for joining us for a third time.
We were about to talk about peeling a spruce root. So I don't know when the video cut out, so I'm just going to run through this again really quick. So I dug roots this morning, and it's good to peel roots as soon as you can. If you let them dry out, they can be really hard, almost impossible to peel. Insects also like to get into the bark and can chew into the root, and then you lost your root. You go to pull your roots out, and they're just powdered under the bark. So you can peel the bark off the root, and it'll come off pretty well in the summer, but if you want it to come off really easily, you can simmer them in a pot for 10 Simmer them for a while, and you just check on it. And when they peel easily, that's when they're ready. My estimate is 10 minutes. I don't know if that's accurate. This is a pot that I use for things like boiling spruce roots. So there's some pitchy, sticky stuff built up along the edge. I wouldn't use your finest cooking pots. I don't know what it would be like to try to clean that off of a pot. So, how do you peel a spruce root? Go along with your finger, peel the bark? Sure, you could do that. Or, hold one foot on the ground to hold it in place. I have 2 sticks. Any stick will work. The sods. So, check it out, how quick. Nice, clean spruce root. We're not going to go into too much depth with the spruce roots. You could now coil this up, continue peeling, and have a stash of spruce roots to pull from for whatever you need, whatever you're trying to lash together with spruce roots. The next thing that's typically done with spruce roots in preparing them for weaving would be to split them. We're going to try to, can you see that line? There's some little nodes where little branches were. Is that picking up? That line, some people have referred to it like a zipper. That's where we're going to split the spruce root. If you were able to tune in earlier when we were talking about splitting birch bark, this is quite different, but similar. A similar skill worth learning is splitting. So I just dig my nail in. Doesn't really matter what end you start with. And I'm trying to line it up so that I split right along that line. That's where the root naturally wants to split. But you still have to pay attention. The thing with splitting anything, is that you're trying to keep even tension on both sides. Even if it wants to just, it's also a little bit nice to have a little bit of bottom tension, so it's kind of nice to be sitting, but not necessary. But you're just pulling even tension on both sides. If one side starts to get a little bit thin, then you pull harder on the other side to bring the split back to center. Oh, did anyone catch that? I got a little off center and corrected it. Still a little off. Go. So now we have 2 roots, which is a good start, but then there's a 3rd step that we still have to do. See that woody part of the root? We're going to split the root one more time to get that pithy center out of it. Why? It's just another refining step to even out the root. Our root, it has a lot of variability in width because it tapers. Like any natural material, it can be pretty irregular. So one end is thicker, one end is wider, and one end is narrower, and we can work some of that out with our splitting. But this outer piece of the root, that's going to be our finished piece that we keep. This inner piece, it's not super strong. It can kind of split and tear apart. That's going to be like our scrap piece. Anyways, sometimes it runs out, and then you scoop it up and start again, splitting it down to the refined width that you want. Anyways, I'm not going to finish that too much right now. But, so root has a lot of uses. I was showing it stitched on this woven basket. Just to hold the rim on there. Here's another basket. This is a, this is a shape and design that would be traditionally found in this area, an Anishinaabe design, makuk style. And this is a single piece of bark that's folded and stitched together with root. So there's root holding the basket sides together there. There's root holding the rim on. There's also some decorative root going around the edge. And a lot of different stitches happening. But the root, it's really pliable when it's wet. I'd even dare to say it might even have a little bit of stretch. I don't know if that's accurate, but you can really crank on it to some degree. And then when it dries totally stiff and hard. So, you know, you tie like a simple knot to finish it off, but it doesn't have to be too structural because the root will dry stiff. So what else do we got here for materials? We talked a little bit about birch bark. We talked about root. I mentioned this little basswood cord. We don't have basswood up here in Grand Marais, but in other parts of the state we do. And the bark is really amazing. Does anyone know where the basswood bark is? Here's a thin strip of bark that's been peeled from a tree. It's very fibrous and stringy. So nothing has been done to this bark. This is just off the tree. The outer bark has been removed. But I mean, that wasn't a good example. It has this really stringy quality to it. But when soaked in water, these layers start to peel apart. That's a process called retting. I think there was another North House video where Mercedes was talking about net making, and she goes into a little more depth about basswood bark. But it's really a very fibrous material, so you can soak it in water, and that will help the fibers break down into softer ribbons that can be used to make rope, thin cords, really pliable. And you can also boil the basswood bark in wood ash. So this bark boiled in a thick, what was I using it for in those baskets? Little cord that not super structural, but you can use this for structural things. You can twist it into rope. Another good material just to have on hand and twist into cord as part of your basket. We have some of it soaking in the lake right now. That's probably half retted. It can take, the stuff soaking in the lake, it can take a couple weeks. It can vary depending on temperature, things like that. Let's see, what else do we got? Birch bark, spruce root, basswood bark. So willow. Willow's a really exciting material. Here is an example of a willow stick. This is just a wild willow that was growing. They often have this lighter underside of the leaf. That's a really good distinguishing characteristic. The leaves are also alternate, not opposite. There's tons of different kinds of willow growing. A lot of people think of the weeping willow tree. That is a willow that's related. It has these nice long shoots that come down, but they're not super structural. So the willow that I'm talking about for baskets, it's more of a shrub. It grows in more like a shrubby bush style. And the shoots that we use are just the first year growth. So the first year that the willow is growing, it just sends up these nice long individual shoots. And the second year it starts to get really branchy, which gets less useful to us. And I use a lot of wild willow and cultivated willow. There's tons of different really beautiful varieties. In this tarp here, you can see different colors, different characteristics. I really like this orange stuff. It's what I know as sandbar willow, a wild growing willow. It maintains it retains its orange color really well. Sometimes willow changes as it ages when it dries out. This willow has all been cut and dried and then re-soaked. So it's best if it just dries out for a year. I mean, it's probably dry before that, but then you're kind of on that cycle. You harvest the willow in the fall. When it's at its longest length, it's done growing. It's kind of going into its dormant phase. And then you just set that aside and weed with the aged stuff. Then you just know it's totally dried out. And to re-soak the willow, this stuff's soaked in the lake for 5 days or so, and then it's been wrapped up in a tarp for another 4 or 5 days, which is a process called mellowing. So just soaking it isn't quite enough. It needs to sit and absorb that moisture. I don't totally get what's happening, but I feel like it it kind of equalizes the moisture in the stick, and it makes it so that you can take a really thick end of willow, and when you carefully bend it, it'll bend. I mean, I think this is more pliable than a fresh willow. You'd often think that fresh would be a little more pliable. But I think with fresh, I mean, the wood to me in the fresh willow feels harder, so it would be more likely to snap. This is mellowed, so it's softened it a lot. So that's a sign that it's done mellowing, it's ready to weave. You can also take the tip of the willow and wrap it around our finger. Really nice and pliable. So this is all stuff that's, I don't know how many years old, but it had been soaking, and so now it's ready to work with. The other really cool thing about willow is that if you find a patch, it's often I'll harvest out of ditches and on public land usually, unless there's really nice willow growing somewhere. I might ask someone permission if I can cut the willow growing on their roadside if I'm near a house. But people have always told me, like, you just go get it. Like, there's mowers that come by and they maintain the ditches, they cut into the ground under power lines, things like that. With birch bark, there's a system of permits. You don't just go out and start peeling bark. You need to know that you're in a place where it's okay for you to be doing that. And so the willow is also really neat in that you can cut a whole patch of willow to the ground and it just shoots back up better and happier than ever. Willow loves to be cut. It can get really top heavy, the bigger trees, and start breaking from all the weight of the shoots that they put out. So it's helpful to the willow. It loves being cut, and that's how you maintain a patch. You just keep cutting it and cutting it. So let's see. Oh, so also another really cool use of willow. Those are all just 1-year-old shoots. This is a willow bark tray that I'm really excited about. This was one that I made based on looking at some pictures of Catherine Lewis's baskets that she made recently out of willow bark. I think she goes, is it Willow Basket Maker on Instagram? I can't remember. But anyways, so willow bark is really neat. If those willows don't get cut every year, they'll get a little bit older. And these have the tops cut off, but I mean, this is probably, I don't know, for a wild willow, this is probably 5 years old maybe. So these are from a roadside that was cut, and then the willow started to grow, and we ended up with all these nice, straight, clean poles. So same thing applies. I mean, when you cut these down, more willow shoots are going to grow next year. And this works in the summer. Right now the bark is starting to stick a little bit, but starting in like late spring and all through the summer, the bark will peel really easily. Until it starts to get a little sticky, which it kind of is. Uh-oh.
What are you guys doing?
We're making a live video right now.
Oh, wow. Do you have a lot of people following you right now?
Yeah, 28 people.
So, check it out. I cut these a couple days ago, so it was a little bit hard to get started because it had dried out a bit right at the end where I had cut it. This is really different from the birch bark that we were talking about earlier. This is the inner bark and the outer bark all together as one piece, which is how most trees barks function. And I'm peeling this off in couple pieces because it's a pretty narrow pole. So if I were to try to just peel another big wide sheet off, it might be a little too wide, which would, I don't know, sometimes it can crack if you try to peel off too wide of a strip, I guess.
It's very moist.
Oh yeah.
Someone said that this looks very satisfying.
It's so satisfying. For those of you that really like to make sure you're using all the pieces, I cut down these bottom pieces for bark for baskets, and then the top pieces get all branchy, and there's a lot of business going on, and you can just like rip the bark off of those without worrying about making nice strips. And you can use the bark from the smaller branches for dyes or for tanning hides if that's something you do. They have a lot of tannins in them for turning hides into leather. And so the next thing I would do then with these would be to decide what I'm going to make and cut things to approximate length and just cut it with a scissors. You could take a straight edge and be creative however you want it, but yeah, it's really neat stuff. You can also incorporate it into, so we were looking at this as a sample. Willow bark is really neat. I've been asking around about forms of basketry in the world. As far as what I've read, are typically big slabs of bark, just folded and stitched. Really pry a sheet of bark off of a tree and stitch it into a vessel. And you know, like we use what's around us. And as far as I know, there's no great traditions of using willow bark in this way. Probably in some places where maybe there's bigger willows and using those slabs. But I don't know if I should say this on the record because I don't know if it's true, but I've been asking around a little bit, and I feel like it's something that's really just been catching on a lot, using willow bark in this way in the last, I don't know, 30 years or so, which is kind of fun to think about, just like taking the materials that you know and are around us and using weaving techniques that are established old weaving techniques. I mean, there's nothing new about any of this. Symbols like the traditional rims that we see on baskets. I often will take this and then just coil it up and let it dry, and then you can re-soak it for later. You could also use it right now. I haven't really noticed some materials shrink a lot when they dry, like the willow sticks, for example. It's much better to let them dry out totally and then re-soak them. But I haven't noticed a great difference with this. If you weave something fresh, it's just gonna shrink. And it's also, if you let it dry out and re-soak it, it's still gonna shrink a little bit, but it's not much different. It doesn't matter if you work with it fresh or dry and re-soak. So I was gonna start on a basket. I'm not gonna do too much because it's kind of slow. So this is a base of a basket. I like to make bases of baskets ahead of time. And then when you're ready to weave a basket, you just pick up your base and go. So people love to wonder, how long does it take to make a basket? Has anyone typed in that question yet?
No.
No? Wow. Okay, so how long does it take to make a basket? I don't know. It depends on a lot of things. First, we have to harvest the materials. We have to bundle and sort the materials. We have to select the materials for weaving, soak the materials, take them out of the soaking tank, wrap them up for mellowing, and then we're ready to weave. So one thing I like to do is just have a bunch of bases on hand. So all of these baskets start with a base that was made ahead of time. So I probably made this, I don't know, 3 months ago or something, which is great. So we're
asking if basswood is a tilia?
Ooh, good question. Who asked that? Was it someone I knew?
Lily
I don't know.
Vanellini Horseman, who is in the UK.
Can anybody else answer that? Basswood meaning the same as linden or lime, if that answers your question. So I think so. I'm not great with the botanical names of things. But yeah. Lime, bass, linden. Oh, let me talk about what I'm doing. Okay, sorry. So here's the base of a basket. Basically, we're going to put the basket on top of it. I leave all these long until I'm ready to start inserting the upright sticks. But I selected all of these sticks already, and I tapered the ends so that they'll slide in there really nice. There's all these little spaces that we have available to put our sticks in. So there's a lot of good tricks if you work with willow. These are really subtle, but I think they're important. So here's my pruning shears. So I'm going to cut this. I'm going to cut one at a time, and then I'm going to put an upright in, cut, put, instead of cut, 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 cut. Just because sometimes, I don't know, the weaving could maybe be a little loose and start to come out. But the other thing, when you're using your pruning shears, you always want to, the side that you're going to keep, I'm going to keep this and discard this. So see how that would be a much closer cut than that? That would leave us a little bit of space. That's going to be a closer cut.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Little tricks that I like. So now we can make a few decisions. We've got this big white cut end. Do we want to see that? Not really. This is going to be the inside of my basket. I could put that end so that it's down. I could put it so that it's facing that stick and hidden. And we're just gonna jam that in there as far as we can. That one went in pretty easy. If they don't go in very easy, you can use make a space bigger.
Somebody is wondering when your 2021 schedule will be out.
Ooh, good question. I wonder that too. I really don't know. But I mean, yeah, I feel like baskets are this thing that it's like, oh, that'd be fun. I'd like to make a basket. I'd make a willow basket. But I mean, willow's kind of a full body thing.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the hands. I mean, just starting in the hands, but you know, I mean,
look at that, yeah.
I could be making this easier by using my tools, but I'm just gonna put in one more, and then I'm gonna pretend that they're all in and show you the next step, because the next step is what I think is one of the most exciting steps. And so you'll notice I'm just putting one stick in for each. I might end up putting 2 sticks in some places, just depending on the spacing that I want, but for demonstration purposes, we're just doing that. So, when we looked in the tarp earlier and tested that thick stick to see how it would bend, it bent really well. And there's a lot of different ways you could bend these sticks upright. If you imagine that I had a million, or maybe 32 or so sticks coming out in all directions. Right now we just have 4, just to keep it simple. But I could bend this up. I could pinch it with a pliers to kind of compress the stick right where I want it to bend. But I really like pricking up, it's called. And it creates, I don't know, kind of like a hinge. So I take my knife and I hold it kind of like a pencil with my right hand, and I use my left thumb to pivot the angle that I want, and I'm going just a little bit out from the edge of my weaving, and I'm going to poke my knife in just into the center of the stick, about halfway through, and then all in one motion I'm going to turn my knife and bend the stick up. So that's made this little, can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
This little hole.
Oh yeah.
So we poke our knife in just part way through, right into the pith, the center of the stick. And we bend the stick up. Oh, that one's a lot better. You see that one?
So you're only going about halfway in.
Yes. And that's creating this nice bend.
She's in there.
See how nicely that bent?
Mm-hmm.
So we then would go around and do that to every stick. And then start our weave. What else were we going to talk about? I think that's... Anyway, so there's all these really beautiful basketry traditions that are super fun and inspiring to learn from, and as a way of learning about our own environment and other places in the world and people, and we can also take those materials and create new things all together. Here's a sample of some material variety. So what do we got here? Cedar bark on the bottom, that little star, woven with spruce root, which we peeled and split earlier. This first little band is tent caterpillar silk, pulled off of the tree and then spun into little cords by my hands. And then the top, we have some moose sinew and a little basswood bark handle.
Do you know if this is the world's smallest basket?
It is not. I would call this a large
small basket.
A large small basket. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tiny baskets are what are they?
A niche.
Yeah, very exciting. A good thing to try. A good test of your patience and things. So
I sent out a last call for questions. We haven't gotten any.
all right.
What would you say your most common basket questions are that you get?
How long does it take?
And
what's
it
the
depends.
answer? I don't know. It depends what we're doing.
Someone asked, how do you weave after you bend the frame? So I guess.
Well, I can show you a little bit. So after this, I like to use a 3-rod whale. So this basket, it's really nice and easy to see. We have a band of weaving that's really distinct here, and then something very different, and then the same band of weaving there. So this is a willow basket, and it is made up of a whale, and then a rand, and then a whale. The whale is a really nice strong weave that helps set the shape and control that upward start. And this is actually kind of a strange whale that maybe we shouldn't look at. This is a more typical whale. That one's doing this little arrow pattern, but this is a little bit more typical. And that's done with 3 pieces of willow going in front of 2 behind 1, and there's 3 pieces that are just going around and around and around. And this is called a French rand. There are 32 sticks weaving all at once until they run out, and then another whale on top, and another rand, another whale, border, handles.
Somebody asked what class you would recommend for a beginner.
I think that any beginner basketry class is excellent. There are such different... I think I like to do all the kinds of basketry, or at least many of them, and they're so different. Like, if willow is something that you're drawn to, that's a great thing. Like, this is if you want, like, strong, stand this upside down, jump on it, fill it up with rocks, carry it around. Or like whatever's around you, whatever material is a good start, I think. Weaving with birch bark is really fun and satisfying as well. And I think that material can be a little bit harder to get, but I think that it's very versatile. Like, I could be working on this and take it with me. I could start it and stop and pick it up again in a month. With willow, I just need to weave it start to finish. You can't really stop and then re-soak and start again and work on it over time. But you also really need to plan for willow. If I'm going to weave with willow, I need to plan like 2 weeks out because I have to soak my material.
Someone actually asked, how long do you have to soak the willow?
There's all kinds of guidelines. Like, people say a day per foot of length as sort of a base reference. But I'm always soaking willow that's like both this long and this long, and I just soak them all the same amount of time. I go with 4 or 5 days.
Okay.
5 days. I know other people that soak it for almost 2 weeks. There's very huge variation. 5 days is my favorite, and then I wrap it in a tarp and check on it and see if it's ready after 4 or 5 days in the tarp.
Somebody asked how many different patterns are there? I guess that's the weaving patterns?
I think that there are infinite patterns. I don't use any kind of patterns, except for like with these kinds of baskets, I do use a paper pattern to first test the design and see how things are going to fold and fit together. And you can create those patterns yourself. There's also very traditional patterns and designs that people use. But in terms of willow, there's willow weavers that have really specific baskets that they make over and over again. I'm not making it up.
Does it matter if you dry the willow in the sun or the shade after harvesting?
I would dry it in the shade. I think that the sun is hard on things, and it takes a long time to dry willow. It's not going to be dry in a few days. It's gonna. You want to just like let it sit for months, like put it away. You can weave with fresh willow. I always tell people if they want to weave, don't wait for 4 months for your willow to dry. Like just weave a basket, and it's gonna shrink and loosen up, and that's okay because you still just wove a basket.
And can you harvest willow any time of year?
You know, not really. Right now, the summer, like high summer, the bark will slip off, peel off, the willow will be a lot more brittle. But I've woven with fresh willow. I think in terms of just like learning and exploring and playing with materials, yeah, you can harvest any time of year, but the best time to harvest, like the time to harvest is in the fall. The best time is after the leaves drop, before you have 3 feet of snow on the ground. The willow's done all its growing that it's going to do. There's no leaves to deal with. You want that just like first year growth.
Someone asked if you are still selling your baskets and if you have a website.
I have a website, emilyderke.com. I don't think I've updated it in like 3 years. I'm not selling any baskets right now. I've really shifted to doing a lot more teaching and less selling, and occasionally I get into the selling mode, but in general, not at this time. I would like to say one disclaimer. I do a lot of experimental things with basketry, which I think is great, and there are very defined and specific traditions with willow, with birch bark, with any material, which I'm just saying as a word of caution in case any of my very accomplished willow weaver teachers happen to buy this.
All right, last question. What inspired you to get you to start basket weaving?
You know, I really wanted to make things that I could use with few tools, using the materials around me, and it just seemed like a good place to start in willows, or basketry in general. Willow's where I started, so I talk a lot about willow, but I mean just learning like tool use, learning how to work with your hands, learning patterns and designs, and learning the traditions of the area, learning about the plants in the area is really was really exciting to me. I felt like I bought everything that I used. I had no connection to the things in my life, and somehow that became a starting point. Containers seemed like a way to dive into that. How do we make vessels that we can carry and use? I lived on the West Coast for a while with a basket maker, Margaret Mathewson, and learned a lot for 2 years just living and absorbing as much as I could from her. So it's a good way to go, to live with a basket maker.
Great.
All right.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.